As soon as her friend came out of the restaurant, him and the other friend, they went to look for her, and she was gone, nowhere to be found.
Trust is a fragile thing, especially in small towns. It's the invisible thread that binds communities together, creating a sense of safety, of knowing your neighbors, of believing that the darkness of the world stops at your town's borders. But what happens when that thread snaps? When the unthinkable creeps in, turning peaceful riverbanks into crime scenes and friendly faces into suspects? In the summer of 1988, the quiet town of Sumner, Washington, learned just how quickly that sense of security could shatter. A young woman's body, stripped of both clothing and dignity, drifted in the murky waters where the Puyallup and White Rivers meet. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. But for 2 haunting months, she would remain nameless, her identity as mysterious as the circumstances of her death. This is the story of Tracy Whitney, an 18-year-old whose dreams were violently stolen one August night. It's a tale of a killer who walked free for decades, of a family's relentless pursuit of answers, and of how modern science finally unveiled secrets that the river had kept hidden for 34 years. But most of all, it's a reminder that in small towns where everyone knows everyone, the most dangerous person might be the stranger you never noticed at all. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. On August 28, 1988, the serene waters of the Puyallup River held a grim secret. 2 fishermen, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful Sunday morning, became unwitting witnesses to a tragedy. Where the Puyallup and White Rivers converge, they spotted something that would haunt them forever. The nude body of a young woman floating face down in the murky waters. The discovery sent shockwaves through Pierce County. Sheriff's deputies rushed to secure the scene, their patrol cars shattering the Sunday morning quiet. The peaceful riverbank transformed into a hub of investigative activity. Yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the summer breeze. The victim showed clear signs of violence, her body bearing witness to her final moments. The complete absence of clothing or personal effects made it clear this was no accident. Someone had taken great care to strip away anything that might identify her, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through Sumner and its neighboring communities. In these small towns, where violent crime was rare, such incidents hit particularly hard. Parents kept their children closer, and neighbors eyed strangers with newfound suspicion. The community's sense of security, once taken for granted, now seemed as fragile as morning frost. Local media swarmed the scene, their evening broadcasts fueling speculation. Was this an isolated incident? Could there be more victims? And perhaps most terrifying, was the killer still among them? For detectives, these early hours were crucial. They meticulously documented every detail, searching for anything that might identify their Jane Doe. But the river had kept its secrets well. Her family remained unaware of her fate, not knowing their loved one lay in the county morgue.
Who was Tracy? Where does she go? What does she do? Who does she hang out with? Who would possibly hurt her?
Before she became a headline in one of Washington's most haunting cold cases, Tracy Jean Whitney was just a young woman standing on the threshold of adulthood. Born in 1970, she grew up in Washington State, the eldest daughter in a close-knit family. At 18, she was just beginning to write her own story, unaware that someone else would tragically pen its final chapter. Those who knew Tracy remember a quiet strength about her. She wasn't the type to command attention, but her presence had a way of making others feel at ease. Her sister Robin, just 11 when Tracy died, cherishes precious memories of an extraordinary big sister. In every birthday photo from my childhood, Robin would later recall, Tracy stands behind me, this protective presence, her face glowing with pride. She was the kind of sister who made even ordinary moments feel special.
She's 7 years older than me. I don't remember a lot.
Tracy was quiet, never really ever caused a problem. She had your normal childhood, good kid.
Friends remember Tracy defying typical teenage stereotypes. Sweet and loyal were words often used to describe her, someone who would go out of her way to help others without expecting anything in return. Having recently graduated high school, she was navigating that delicate space between childhood and independence with remarkable grace. Tracy's last summer was filled with moments that seem ordinary until they become precious memories. She helped neighborhood kids with lemonade stands, spent evenings with friends, and made plans for her future. Her mother remembers Tracy's infectious laugh, how it could light up a room. She was good, her mother would later say, voice thick with emotion. Just genuinely good. The last clear memory Robin has of her sister is from her own 11th birthday party, weeks before Tracy's disappearance.
When I was 11, she came over for my birthday party. This is how I last remember her. There was a twinkle in her eyes. She looked happy. I remember being upset because I hadn't seen her in a while and only truly beginning to know who she was.
That birthday would become more than just a celebration. It would be the last time Robin would see her sister alive. Tracy's story could have been one of triumph, of a young woman coming into her own. She could have been the sister who watched Robin grow up, the daughter who made her parents proud, the friend who kept in touch over the years. Instead, her story became a reminder that even in the safest communities, darkness can find its way in.
I was devastated, felt like my world had ended. It was just the worst moment of my life.
August 27th, 1988, began as just another summer Saturday in Federal Way, Washington. The kind of day that should have melted into countless others in memory. Instead, it would become the day that changed everything for the Whitney family. It was the last day anyone would see Tracy alive. The evening started innocently enough. Tracy had gone to a local Burger King with friends, a typical weekend hangout spot for local teenagers. The restaurant, with its familiar fluorescent lights and plastic booths, was packed with the usual weekend crowd. But what began as a casual night out would soon take a dark turn that no one could have predicted. Witnesses later described a tense scene unfolding at the restaurant. Tracy became involved in an argument with her ex-boyfriend, the details of which would later become crucial to investigators. The quarrel escalated, emotions running high. Those who saw Tracy that night remember her being visibly upset, tears in her eyes. Then, in a moment that would haunt everyone present, she walked out of the restaurant and into the warm August night. Her friends, concerned about her emotional state, immediately went looking for her. They searched the parking lot, calling her name. They checked nearby streets and familiar hangouts, but Tracy had vanished into the darkness. At first, they hoped she had just gone home to cool off, a reasonable assumption given the circumstances. No one imagined they were witnessing the beginning of a nightmare. Hours ticked by with no word from Tracy. For a responsible young woman who always kept in touch with family and friends, this silence was deafening. Her mother, initially trying to stay calm, began making increasingly worried phone calls. Each unanswered ring amplified the growing sense of dread. This wasn't like Tracy. She wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. By the next morning, panic had set in. Tracy hadn't come home. She hadn't called. She hadn't reached out to any friends. Her bed remained untouched, her personal belongings exactly where she'd left them. Her family contacted the police. But in 1988, missing person cases, especially involving teenagers, often weren't treated with immediate urgency. There was a tendency to assume young people had simply run away, would cool off, would come home on their own. But Tracy's family knew better. They knew their daughter, their sister. This wasn't a rebellious teenager running away from home. This was something far more sinister. As Sunday dawned, they couldn't know that just miles away, fishermen were about to make a discovery that would confirm their worst fears. The time between Tracy leaving the Burger King and the discovery of her body would later become the focus of an intense investigation. What happened in those crucial hours? Who did she encounter? How did she end up in the river? These questions would haunt investigators and family alike for decades to come. Less than 24 hours after walking out of that Burger King, Tracy's life ended violently. While her family searched frantically and friends waited for her call, she was already gone, her body drifting in the dark waters of the Puyallup River. At the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office, her story was written only in bruises and trauma.
In this particular case, there were a lot of blunt force injuries on her. The medical examiner actually ruled it as a homicide due to the fact she had died of asphyxiation caused by strangulation with probable smothering as well.
The autopsy painted a horrific picture: death by asphyxia, a violent struggle marked by multiple injuries, and evidence of sexual assault. The killer had methodically stripped away all identification, but left behind crucial DNA that would prove fatal. Decades later, for 2 haunting months, she remained nameless, while detectives worked through missing persons reports, and the community held its breath. Parents kept their children closer. Young women traveled in groups. Everyone wondered, was there a predator among them? October 1988. Finally gave her back her name through dental records. The revelation stunned the community. Tracy wasn't just another statistic, she was one of their own. The investigation exploded into high gear with her ex-boyfriend as an immediate focus, but his alibi proved solid, and other suspects were gradually cleared. What baffled investigators most was the attack's random nature. With no cell phones or security cameras, crucial timeline gaps proved impossible to fill. Their killer had managed to abduct, assault, and murder Tracy without leaving a single witness, suggesting either incredible luck or chilling experience. The trail cooled, but detectives preserved the DNA evidence, though testing in 1988 was primitive. That evidence would wait decades in storage, a silent witness holding secrets that technology wasn't yet ready to reveal. Tracy's family endured each day like a fresh wound, while her case joined Pierce County's growing stack of unsolved homicides. Yet the detectives never forgot. The brutality, Tracy's youth, the randomness, it all suggested a predator who might strike again. They knew he was out there, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. And someday, somehow, the evidence they'd preserved would finally speak Tracy's truth.
I don't think the grief will ever go away. It'll never go away. It's the first thing I think about when I get up in the morning, last thing I think about at night. I felt like somebody had reached down my throat and pulled my heart out.
Time should heal all wounds, but for those connected to Tracy Whitney's case, the years only deepened the scars. As the 1990s dawned and her file joined Pierce County's growing stack of cold cases, the pain remained razor sharp, especially for her sister, Robin. Every milestone was like losing her all over again, Robin would later recall, her voice catching. Birthdays, Christmases, graduations, there was always an empty chair where Tracy should have been. Their mother kept a box of Tracy's belongings untouched, a time capsule of a life frozen at 18. Years passed, but their hope for justice never wavered. even as leads grew colder and witnesses' memories faded. The case wasn't completely dormant. Periodically, detectives would dust off Tracy's file, poring over evidence they'd memorized years ago, hoping fresh eyes might catch something they'd missed. But their killer had been careful, methodical, leaving behind only DNA evidence that 1990s technology couldn't unlock. Each renewed investigation ended in familiar frustration. 2005 brought what seemed like a breakthrough. Tracy's DNA evidence was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's revolutionary database linking crime scenes to offenders nationwide. Her family dared to hope again.
I said, this is it. This is it. This is the break that we've been waiting for.
But month after month, year after year, no matches appeared. Their killer remained a ghost, his DNA uncatalogued in any system. Behind the scenes, forensic science raced forward. What had been impossible in 1988 became routine by the 2000s. DNA testing grew more sophisticated, requiring mere traces to yield results that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier.
I knew that with the new technology in DNA research, it was a good chance that we could get this solved. So that kind of gave me a hope.
The original investigators' dedication in preserving evidence at a time when many departments routinely destroyed old samples would prove crucial. Robin refused to let her sister's case fade into obscurity. She became Tracy's tireless advocate, building relationships with detectives, attending cold case conferences, keeping the story alive in local media. "I promised myself people wouldn't forget her," Robin said. "Someone knew something. We just had to find them." Then in 2018, genetic genealogy exploded into public consciousness with the arrest of the Golden State Killer. Suddenly, cases that had seemed forever unsolvable had new hope. For Tracy's family, watching that case unfold felt like standing on the edge of a breakthrough. After 3 decades of dead ends, could this new science finally put a name to their nightmare? As 2021 approached, they had no way of knowing that Tracy's case was about to break wide open. But the answer, when it finally came, would prove more bittersweet than anyone could have imagined. Tracy Whitney's case still haunted retired Detective Sergeant Linnell Anderson. After countless investigations across her career, this one refused to let go. The carefully preserved DNA evidence from 1988 held secrets, waiting for science to catch up to their killer's identity. Anderson's determination drove her to secure a grant from the Washington State Attorney General's office for cutting-edge DNA testing. Her goal was audacious but simple: unmask the predator who had eluded justice for over 3 decades. The approval felt like the first ray of hope in years.
And finally, she called me up one day and she said, "Ron, I'm going to come up. Got the ID on the murder. But I want to tell you something right now. There's not going to be an arrest."
Enter Parabon Labs, pioneers in genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique that had finally unmasked the Golden State Killer. This wasn't standard DNA testing. It was genetic detective work on an unprecedented scale. In March 2022, Tracy's preserved evidence arrived at their lab, carrying with it the weight of 34 years of unanswered questions. The process was like building a massive puzzle without having the picture. Genetic genealogists worked backward through time, constructing intricate family trees stretching back centuries. Each DNA match was a potential pathway to their killer, each branch of the family tree a possible route to justice. One wrong turn could derail years of work. Then, in August 2022, a name emerged from the genetic maze: John Guillot Jr. But the breakthrough came with a devastating twist. Guillot had died from cancer in January 2022, just months before his identification. Even more frustrating, his body had been cremated, seemingly taking with it any chance of final confirmation. But Detective Anderson refused to let her quarry slip away one last time. Learning that Guillot's recently deceased son's remains were at the medical examiner's office, she saw one last chance. The DNA comparison was conclusive. The son's genetic profile proved that his father was the man who had left his DNA on Tracy's body. The evidence was undeniable. Their killer had been living in Puyallup all along, just miles from where he had disposed of Tracy's body. For 34 years, Guillot had walked freely among them, probably driving past the very spots where detectives had searched for clues, carrying his dark secret until cancer, not justice, finally claimed him. For Anderson and her team, the identification brought a complex mix of triumph and regret. They had finally solved one of their most haunting cold cases, but Guillot would never face a jury, never have to confront Tracy's family, never have to answer for his crimes. Science had revealed his identity, but death had granted him one final escape. As investigators dug into John Guillot Jr.'s past, a disturbing portrait emerged that chilled them to the bone. This wasn't some drifting predator who had struck and vanished. He was their neighbor. A longtime resident of Puyallup, Guillot had lived for decades, just miles from where he'd disposed of Tracy's body, blending seamlessly into the fabric of small-town life. At 65, Guillot had mastered the art of invisibility through ordinariness. He was the kind of man who could live next door for years without drawing a second glance. But beneath this unremarkable exterior lurked something monstrous, and investigators soon discovered Tracy might not have been his only victim. 2 other deaths now cast long shadows over Guillot's past. In 2010, his girlfriend died under suspicious circumstances. A decade later, in 2020, his wife's death drew similar scrutiny. In both cases, Guillot had been questioned but never charged. The evidence too circumstantial. His explanations just plausible enough. But now these cases took on a darker meaning. This wasn't just about Tracy anymore, Detective Anderson revealed, her voice tight with contained fury. We had to wonder how many others there might have been. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 decades of suspicious deaths, all connected to one man who had perfected the art of escaping justice. Tracy's murder now appeared to be the work of an experienced predator. Unlike many homicide cases where victim and killer share some connection, Guillot had chosen her opportunistically. Young, vulnerable, alone, she had been the perfect target for a hunter who likely had years of practice both before and after that fatal night in 1988. The most haunting aspect wasn't just what Guillot had done, but how close he'd stayed to his crime. For years, he had lived and worked in the area while detectives searched for Tracy's killer. He had probably read about her death in the papers, watched the news coverage, perhaps even joined conversations about the case that had shocked their community. Like a spider in its web, he had watched and waited, secure in his anonymity. When cancer claimed Guillot in January 2022, he nearly took his secrets to the grave. Only the preservation of DNA evidence and the advent of genetic genealogy prevented his final escape, but his death left crucial questions forever unanswered. How many other victims were there? What drove him to kill? How had he maintained his facade of normalcy for so long? The identification of John Guillot Jr. brought an end to decades of uncertainty. But for the Whitney family, the resolution felt hollow. In my head, I always thought we'd be sitting in a courtroom, Robin shared, her voice trembling. Instead, we just have a name. That's where it ends. Her words captured the bittersweet reality of solving a cold case, only to find the killer beyond earthly justice. For the community of Sumner and Federal Way, putting a name to their boogeyman brought its own kind of peace. The shadow that had haunted their collective memory for so long finally had a face. But deeper questions remain. How many other victims did Guillot claim? How many more predators walk among us, hiding behind ordinary facades? And how many families still wait for answers, hoping that advancing science might finally break their case? What do you think? Should we pursue cold cases even when traditional justice is impossible? Share your thoughts below. If Tracy's story moved you, help keep her memory alive by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Remember, every cold case is just one breakthrough away from being solved.